from the point of view of a child, all that matters is the experience they're having.
Right.
And so the idea of daycare was that it was almost, I mean, I think of it as, you know, sort of the parking garage model of child rearing, right? It's like you need a safe place to keep your car while you go to work. So you put your car in this place and it's guarded and so forth. And then you pick it up at the end of the day, right? Yeah. I think that had been our original idea for childcare. Like these babies are just sort of lying there, these young children, they're just learning to talk. They're just learning to walk. Anyone can talk to them, right? So we can just leave them there and then pick them up at the end of the day. And what developmental science tells us is that's completely wrong. That this is actually the most important period of human development in the human lifespan.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and I'm joined by no one. We have Nick is still very much in paternity leave mode, although he's still working his butt off. Really grateful to him. But he's back in West Virginia raising his very real baby, Margot Solheim. But today we decided to have on a guest to talk about all the babies, specifically what the nature of early childhood policy in America is today. The leader of a fantastic new organization. We'll get to that in a moment. As always, be sure to go to AmericanMoment.org. There you can find everything else we have cooking as an organization, backlog of this podcast, events that we're hosting, the deployment of new programs. There should be a couple applications going live very soon for different programs that we're doing. Fellowship 2023, Foundations of American Statecraft, other things in general. Bookmark it, be going as often as you can. Please subscribe to this podcast. I'm shocked how many of you don't actually subscribe. You just kind of go navigate to the episode. It makes your life easier. We only come into your inbox once a week. Don't worry about it. So subscribe on YouTube, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, subscribe on Spotify, subscribe everywhere. It really does help us, and rate and review the podcast as well. Today we had on Katharine B. Stevens, who is the founder and CEO of the Center on Child and Family Policy, CCFP. It's a brand new organization that literally founded just a few days ago, Wednesday of last week. Prior to launching CCFP, she served for more than 6 years as a resident scholar of the American Enterprise Institute's leading early childhood program. Her analysis and commentary have been published in Early Learning Nation, Education Week, The Hill, HuffPost, Institute for Family Studies, Los Angeles Times, National Review, New York Daily News, New York Post, USA Today, US World News Report, and The Wall Street Journal. Her publications include Renewing Childhood's Promise, The History and Future of Federal Early Care and Education Policy, Does Pre-K Work?, The Research on 10 Early Childhood Programs, and What It Tells Us, and Still Left Behind, How America's Schools Keep Failing Our Children. Before joining AEI, Dr. Stevens founded and led Teachers for Tomorrow, one of the first teacher-apprenticeship programs in the United States, which recruited and trained teachers for New York City's lowest performing schools. She began her career as a public education preschool teacher in New Haven, Connecticut, and St. Louis, Missouri. She has a PhD in education policy from Columbia, a master's in education from Teachers College, a MBA from Columbia Business School, and a BA in U.S. history from the University of Chicago. She's very well credentialed, even though she thinks that most of those credentials were pretty silly, that she didn't actually need them. She is a practitioner. She is lovely, and she is a depth of knowledge on everything on this issue. We went super deep on this growing movement that the second a kid pops out of the womb, you have to go hand them over to a public school bureaucracy, why it's bad for kids, why they need their parents, why the two-income trap may have had something to do with all of this, the corporate family and how the erosion of that may have been the cause of this, public health, obesity, everything. I highly, highly recommend, if you at all care about the fact that we are destroying America's kids today, to listen through to the end. It's a fantastic episode. It's a fantastic new organization. Katharine, someone all of you should be paying attention to. We'll go now to Katharine B. Stevens. Katharine, thank you for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
We always like to hear about how our guests got to the point where they are today. You've launched a new think tank, a new organization, but tell us how you got to this point. It's a very interesting path, and I think people would find it quite compelling.
Where I've ended up is unexpected. I grew up in Seattle, Washington in the 1970s, which was kind of the headquarters in some ways of first hopes for the war on poverty. So I grew up really in a big government liberal kind of environment. My parents were both university professors. My mother's a music historian. My father's a neuroscientist. So I was not political at all. I just was brought up with an idea of how the world was and the fact that the federal government was now going to be solving poverty and fixing things. I was brought up with the idea that that was a really great thing, which, of course, from my point of view, if it had worked, it would have been a great thing. But I just, as I said, I was not political. So I went to University of Chicago. I majored in U.S. history. I was looking at ideas from the 19th century, so I wasn't political. I worked in higher education for a number of years. Then I ended up founding and running a not-for-profit, working with low-performing schools in New York City, recruiting and training new teachers using an apprenticeship model. I ran that for 10 years. Over my 10 years in the schools, Which
10 years would that have been?
That was, let me think. That was from 1993 to about 2002.
Okay.
And what I saw was that this idea that I had frankly believed in, which was you have smart people planning things out and you're spending a lot of money and you have the buildings and you have the staff and you have the whole thing. But something was not working because the schools in New York City was 50% of tax dollars. Most wealthy people in New York City don't send their children to public schools, but they're paying a lot of taxes. And people in New York were very supportive of public schools, especially in low-income neighborhoods. The per child cost is high. Back then, it was like $30,000. However, this was not in all cases. There were wonderful schools. There were wonderful, most important classrooms, teachers, but overall, this was failing kids. So that was the first time I started to think this formula that I had been, that I'd sort of grown up believing, didn't always pan out in real life the way one hoped. So I ended up deciding that I wanted to kind of have an impact beyond just running my program. So I went back to graduate school. I got an MBA at Columbia Business School because I was interested in how people who actually run things, whose livelihoods depend on running things well, how they do that. And that was fascinating. And then I decided to get a PhD so that I could be a policy person, which, by the way, worked like a charm. And my thinking was, I spent most of my life not being interested in higher ed because getting higher degrees because the people who know things are the people who are actually doing them. So I found myself in a situation where I had spent years in the public schools, but I had no credentials for being an expert, right? So I decided that knowing what was actually going on was not sufficient to be an expert. I had to have degrees. So I got my PhD to be an expert, and it did work. Then I got to be an expert.
Yeah.
Do
you think you learned much new?
I learned a lot in business school, but I didn't necessarily learn much. Getting my PhD, it was a worthwhile process. Yeah. Just sort of engaged, it's a worthwhile process. But in any case, I decided to do my dissertation on this question, which had bothered me a lot when I was working in the schools, which was there were horrendous teachers. There were some amazing teachers, but some horrendous teachers. And it was just sort of understood that we could not get rid of the teachers, right? You couldn't fire the teachers. These were teachers where the principal knew this was a horrible teacher and all the other school teachers knew that this was a horrible teacher. But it was just sort of known that you could not fire the teacher. And I was just curious about why. This is a system of 70,000 teachers. So my dissertation topic was analyzing all the laws and the rules and the regulations governing teacher evaluation and accountability in New York City. Like, what does it say on paper? So the next sort of turning point in my thinking was the resistance that I got to asking that question. And then second, when I had analyzed at great length the laws and the rules and the regulations, what I discovered was that there's nothing in the system that holds teachers accountable for their performance with children. They're held accountable for the degrees they have. They're held accountable for continuing professional development. But there's nothing on paper that holds them accountable for their work with children. And that conclusion was something that my dissertation advisor had a lot of trouble with. And that was kind of shocking to me. So I'd ask the question, like, well, what about the evidence I've put forward is not supporting my conclusion? And that wasn't a conversation he was interested in having. So that was probably my next moment of thinking that this group of well-meaning people are not asking the questions that need to be asked, and are not engaging sufficiently with the reality of what's actually going on for the people that we are caring about. In the middle there, I moved to Nicaragua, which was a kind of an unexpected development. I went to learn Spanish for I had to do a language exam for my PhD. Ended up loving it, was a graduate student, so I was not earning any money, and was able to live well in Nicaragua for very little money, which enabled me to stick to my guns. The original professor, who was not enthusiastic about my conclusion, ended up leaving my committee. But it took a while, and had I been living in Manhattan, which is where I'd been living when I was doing my PhD, it was at Columbia, I would not have been able to kind of see that through. My experience in Nicaragua, I think, was sort of like the third sort of turning point in my thinking. I speak Spanish now, which I love, but the culture there is so vastly different than the U.S. in critical ways around the way families, the experience of being a child. Right. So I then finished my PhD and ended up in kind of one of those things, getting a job at the American Enterprise Institute as a scholar in early childhood. I actually did teach in preschool when I was in high school and college, and had always loved it. And when I got to AEI, I thought, as many people do, I thought of early childhood as early childhood education, meaning pre-K, and I was called the pre-K scholar. And I was there for about 6 months before I started to resist that. And now my focus has shifted substantially. And when I think of early childhood now, I think primarily of prenatal to age 5, but most certainly prenatal to age 3. So this way that we've kind of narrowed thinking about early childhood to the first year a child shows up in school, I think says a lot about how this society views children, which to me is a kind of a root of a problem that we need to be focused on more. So that was a little bit long, winding road of how I got. So yes. So then just to say so I just became. So when I got to AEI, I had expected that I was going to go back to K-12. Like that was what I'd worked in. That was for my organization. I had expected I was going to go back to Manhattan and work in the K-12 reform scene. After a couple of years at working in early childhood, I cannot imagine going back to K-12 because I've just become so convinced that the importance this period of life is so immense, and our kind of policy, our sort of not just policy, but just sort of our neglect of it as a society is too big. You know, that gap is a big problem. And the field has, until really very recently, it was just a very narrow little field, just thought of as pre-K. That's changing. But it just the field of early childhood, being a young child, needs to be elevated to a more visible level, which is why I decided to found a think tank focused specifically on that.
So it seems like today, the broad consensus in American society, and especially in left-wing policy circles, is that as soon as humanly possible, it's an affirmative good to take the child out of the home and put them into some form of education or daycare or something like that. It sounds like you think that that's a mistake. Why? You know, the way I see this is it was not until the 1960s that we thought of the public schools as our solution, our policy solution to addressing poverty and equalizing opportunity. That was a war on poverty idea. When public schools started, they were a discrete, place that was of importance. Children went there to learn specific, reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? And then the curriculum expanded. But this idea that these big buildings all over America are the place that we accomplish human development of young people. That was never an idea. That had never been an idea of what schools are for. What's happened since the 60s is we're spending an immense amount of money. Almost, I think we're up to $750 billion in many states. It's in all states. It's from a third to a half of state revenue is spent on the public schools. It is it is the vehicle for developing children into adults, right? And we've come to see school as the place where we accomplish that. You'll hear people discussing this issue. They talk about, for example, they'll be talking about school choice, and they will describe people's children as their students. They'll say, well, parents want their students to have choice. They're not students, they're children, right? Children are children. They are not students. We have come to see, in our society, we've come to see children as students. So what we had so this is where I'm seeing this coming from. The way we had thought of early development for a long time is children are kind of these almost inanimate objects, or not objects, but sort of inanimate beings. They just kind of lie there, and then they sort of toddle around. And it's not until they can talk and walk and actually are at an age where they can go to school that we were thinking of them as being, real human beings, right? What's happened is we've now come to understand that learning starts at birth, that it is not the case. Anyone who has their own baby and pays any attention can tell that starting at the moment of birth, there is a very engaged human there. And what the science is telling us is that the brain development at that period is almost beyond comprehension. So as we have come to understand that babies are learning from birth, that has led us to think, well, that means they need to be
from in school from birth, right? We've come to education really means human development, but we've come to conflate education, human development, with schooling. When we think human development, we think schooling. And so now that we understand that early development is essential, there's this inclination to think, well, that means that we need earlier schooling. That was first evident with pre-K, that people became convinced, yes, we can understand that 4-year-olds are learning more than we thought, right? So when we want to help support the development of 4-year-olds, how do we do that? Well, we have one answer for supporting young people's development, and that's school. So we'll put them in school. So that idea that the way a young person is developed is they go to school seems to me to be at the root of it. There is this idea that on the right, people talk about, the government, kind of getting their claws into people young. And I can imagine that may be a part of it. I don't really see that actually right now in the early development period. I don't see that as the driver as much as this idea that the important place that learning and development occurs is in a non-parental group institutional environment.
Is one of the tails wagging the dog on this phenomenon that there is a growing movement, implicit or explicit, based around the idea that parents may not be qualified to raise their own children? You have babysitters having bachelor degree requirements in certain states now. How much do you think that plays into it? The same credentialization that you experience, you weren't allowed to be an expert even though you were without a PhD. Has that percolated all the way down to the most common human relationship in the history of humanity, which is the parent-child relationship? Yes.
Yeah. And you can see this in older ages with the homeschooling movement. I mean, the idea that it is, virtually child abuse if you do not put, say, a 10-year-old in a non-parental group institutional environment, that's where learning takes place. That is just inconceivable that anyone's mother or father or whatever other person in their home could teach them. I think homeschooling is growing, as you know. I think people are discovering that's not actually the case. When you look at how little children learn in school, it's kind of a low bar in the first place. So we already have that idea. We already have the idea that real learning occurs in an institutional environment. And obviously in K-12, there's this, it is true. Having credentials does not make people good teachers. So there's a big flaw in that whole system. On the other hand, it is also obviously the case that you just don't want any old person in there. We don't do a good job of deciding who's in there, but realizing that we need to have some system for having the right person there. I think right now we have the wrong system. That part makes sense. To me, the bigger problem is that just like we feel like parents don't really have a legitimate role in educating a 10-year-old. As we are now thinking of this early development period as mattering, we will come to think that parents aren't really capable of educating a 2-year-old adequately either. This has happened in Sweden. It's so interesting. So I did an event at AAI about 1.5 years ago with 3 women from Sweden. One who is a professor, an older woman who was very involved in a big universal preschool movement in Sweden, a successful universal preschool movement in Sweden about 20 years ago. And
was that universally funding it or universal attendance?
Both.
It was mandatory. Okay.
And I'm trying to remember if it's mandatory. I don't think it's mandatory, but everybody does it.
Okay.
Which is part of the issue. So They established the funding. Which, this is part of what I worry about. They established the funding, and then the culture has followed, right? So they established. So the one guest in this event was this woman who was seeing unintended consequences of something she worked very hard to put into place. I admired her a lot for kind of confronting that, which, as you know, can be unusual. The other two were mothers who are active who were leaders in not just a Swedish movement, but a European movement for parental and mother rights. And when they talk about that, what they're talking about is their right to raise their own child, like little children. So Sweden has universal parental leave. And the way the system has kind of evolved is fathers have it too. They're actually now looking at it. They may have already implemented this, forcing fathers. This is so interesting. This is something would be worth looking into. Forcing fathers to take all their parental leave, because the fathers don't. Yeah. They got months, but they tended not to take it. So Sweden thinks that the father should just be at home more. So I can imagine all kinds of ways that could play out for good or for bad, but whatever. Anyway, but in general, mothers do stay home with their baby for the first year. After that, it is really become socially unacceptable to not have your child in a full day preschool program. It's considered being a bad parent if your 2-year-old is not in preschool. There's a couple of, number one, there's evidence that this has not had a positive effect on children, which I don't think is surprising, which we can talk about. Young children are not hardwired to be in these kinds of environments. That's just simply not the way we're evolved to develop. What a 10-year-old needs, or even a 6-year-old, is very, very different from what a 1-year-old needs or a 2-year-old needs. But then the other problem is that you're cutting parents out of the equation. Parents are not considered qualified to raise their children after their babies. So part of what these groups are doing, both in Sweden specifically and in Europe more broadly, is like parent coaching to help parents build their confidence. It's like, if you want to stay, this is like actually literally how it is right this minute there. If you want to stay home with your 2-year-old, you actually can do that. You can be what your 2-year-old needs. You don't need training to do this. So that happened in Sweden over the course of a decade or two. That's shift in thinking. And it started with the funding, which as a benefit, right? Which then drove this culture shift, which is exactly what's happened in the United States. We started with this idea that we would have public schools for everyone, and it would be a good idea, and people could do this, right? And that's now, kind of evolved into, that's the only place a child can be. If you want to homeschool your child, that is, practice child abuse. The other thing we've seen in the States is the mandatory age of school attendance in like 1910 or 1905. I don't remember the breakdown, but there were a number of states that had no mandatory entrance. There were a bunch of them that the mandatory entrance was like age 8 or age 7. Wow. And over the course of the 20th century, it went from 8 and a lot of no mandatory, 7, 6, and now we're down to 5. There are and there are states that I think may even at this point, I don't know if there are any states that are mandatory in pre-K. I don't think they've done that yet, but it's about to happen. So you can just see this trend from something that starts as yes, parents would like to have this, to something that is being mandated for how children will develop, even when there's an awful lot of evidence that it's not good for children.
Mm-hmm. I have a kind of interesting question about the mechanics of how that works. It strikes me as potentially plausible. Tell me if I'm wrong, that, let's say before preschool is broadly utilized in a given country or economy, it's primarily probably used by very wealthy people. The preschools are probably extremely well funded. There is a very high quality teacher pool being used to pull into it, and all of the attendant socioeconomic benefits that would come from all those factors mean that any science done on those preschools shows much better results than a program would likely have when implemented at scale across socioeconomic stratum, when you have to recruit millions more employees for that system and have probably less relative amounts of funding directly going into the system than in a super private elite preschool system. Do you think that's happened?
Well, I think in Sweden, from what I understand, yes, the class sizes have gotten, as they've, this national program, class sizes have gotten bigger. There's questions about inadequate teacher quality. And that's certainly, we've seen that again with K-12 in this country. I really see two problems, though. One is what's described here, for example, as a high quality preschool environment is for babies, 8 babies. So there's the way that this is sort of assessed is on the number of children per staff person and the size of the group. Both of those things do matter for a child's experience. So babies is the standard high quality that would be discussed, say, on the Hill, is 4 babies per staff people with a maximum of 8 babies in a room. It is not possible for 2 adults to provide adequate nurture and care to 8 babies. You can imagine if let's say your wife had quadruplets and you were like, oh, honey, that's wonderful. We're so happy we have quadruplets. And you went to work every single day and your wife was at home all day with 4 babies. Yeah. That would be considered outrageous, right? It's one thing to have 4 babies for a couple hours. That's different, right? So if it's a part-time thing, if it's, and we can talk about this, if it's childcare, that's 3 or 4 hours a day. That is not going to be, you can imagine having, let's just say your wife had quadruplets, you guys had quadruplets and your wife is home with them. You could imagine her being alone with quadruplets for, 3 or 4 hours without feeling like this is a catastrophe. But all day, every day, 8, 9, 10 hours a day, it just doesn't make sense. Yeah. We humans don't have litters of children for a reason. We have 1, maybe 2. And historically or evolutionarily, obviously, with a lot of other people to help. So what we think of as hot, now the American Academy of Pediatrics says 3 babies to 1 staff person and a maximum group size of 6. But again, let's say you guys had triplets. Still, we can't, that's not what babies are not hardwired, human babies are not hardwired to be raised in groups. So just that is, I think, a flaw in our thinking. 10-year-olds function fine in groups. But if you look at monkeys, say, when monkeys are very small, they cling to the mother. When they become older, they leave the mother, like little by little, and they start playing with other little monkeys, right? That's what they do. Yeah. It's just natural development. With older children, so the other problem with this, of course, is that we're also hardwired. We develop best in small familiar groups of people with multi-ages. Siblings are very important. So it's like a bleak environment for a baby to be 8, 9, 10 hours a day of your infancy in a room with 2 adults and 7 other babies. That's just not a good way for a baby to be living. 2-year-olds, 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds. If you can also imagine, let's just say now your triplets are 1 or they're 2. They don't need as intense. By your time you're 2, you don't need the same kind of intensive attention. But raising 2-year-olds in a large group of 2-year-olds is just not optimal.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm curious about the other side of the ledger, something that I can't imagine doesn't have implications, is those staff people spending a year with infants every single day for probably more waking hours than their mother does, and then those infants no longer being with them. Is there any sense of what it does to the psychology of an older person to take care of successive generations of infants at that scale for 20 years of a career, 30 years of a career?
I think what's interesting about it is these settings actually don't allow for the kind of loving bond that would lead to that problem, which is an even bigger problem in the first place, right? So if you have a loving grandmother who's living with you, or let's say you're Elizabeth Warren and your Aunt B shows up to take care of your children in the home, which is a wonderful idea.
Right.
I mean, if what we were proposing was a national program, a very expensive national program for an Aunt B in every home, I'd be more interested, right? But you can't replace an Aunt B with a non-parental group institutional program where people are just going, these tiny children are going out. But let's just say Aunt B came and she spent a year with these children and then she had to leave. It would be devastating.
Never see them again.
And never see them again. It would be devastating for the children. It would be devastating for Aunt B. But the circumstances of, say, a childcare center don't lead to that problem. The problem they lead to is the experience of, you can imagine again, let's just say your wife is home with 4 babies. That's going to be a very exhausting, just an absolutely frustrating, exhausting, isolating thing. You can't take care of them all. Yeah. Right? This one needs to be fed. That one needs to be fed. You have to change this one's diapers. And keep in mind that what babies need to develop, what babies live for is eye contact, right? Like interaction. How can you be having, and that's what builds the bond on both sides. Yeah. So how can you, I've known people, I don't know if you have children.
I don't, but my co-founder just had his first.
So he will tell you about this. Yeah. So the bonding happens on both sides. I had a colleague at work who had a baby and he was a kind of a shy person anyway. And I had been doing all this research on infant development. And I said, are you like having eye contact with the baby? And the baby was like a week or 2 old. And he said, well, no, the baby won't do that. I'm like, yes, the baby will too do that. You just have to try. Yeah. So this is like such a serious, wonderful guy. And so I said, this is what you do. I said, you just go up and you just like look at the baby and just do that over and over again. And you'll see within days, this baby, like this was just joy for the baby. And he saw this. He would come and they would look and the baby would just be wiggling all over. That is what nourishes babies. That is how learning occurs for babies. Yeah. We would discuss it periodically. He's like, it works. And the bond that he was developing enormously strengthened. It's interesting that he said that the pediatrician had never mentioned any of this, which is a whole other question in terms of how our healthcare system could be supporting early development better. But in any case, if you are taking care, if you're in a room with one other adult who maybe you like the person, maybe you don't like the other person, and 8 babies, you can't be developing this sort of relationship. Let's just say you're in a room with 6 babies and another person. It's very difficult to develop that kind of relationship. And then, of course, as you're pointing out, and I actually hadn't thought of that much because I've just been so focused on the problems with the environment in the first place. Yeah, I mean, if like how would, it's hard enough for 4th grade teachers. Like if you this isn't your baby, so how there is a high cost to bonding, which if you are doing this year after year, you would avoid. You would avoid bonding. That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah. The other, I imagine, tail wagging the dog in this system is that the biggest sociological change in the way our society works over the past 100 years has been the arrival of both parents into a workplace that is not the home. And so how much do you think that has been the secret sort of implicit impetus for earlier and earlier child formal education outside the home?
Right. Well, so I think the real shift, and this is something I saw from my time in Nicaragua in a way that I had really never occurred to me before. The real shift was from I think what sociologists call the corporate family, where the workplace and the home were the same thing.
Right. A subsistence farm, a blacksmith, whatever.
A store. Yes. So where I lived in Nicaragua is a little town called Granada. This was before political problems there that have caused a lot of, it was sort of a golden era in Nicaragua. It was a wonderful place to live at that time, but it was still very poor. And so Granada was so poor, all of Nicaragua was so poor, there were no Walmarts, for example. There were no big chain stores. I have to say that when I came back to the States, I would remember how convenient it was to have Amazon and to go to these big stores where I could get whatever I wanted. So I was amazed at how much I would miss that. However, what there was instead was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of little businesses. So right on my block, there was the party store business. It's where you went to buy balloons or whatever. There was the sort of the electronic parts little store. There was many, many, many little grocery stores, many, many, many little pharmacies, all owned by a human, an actual person, a human, running it with their family. And that, of course, is how human society has operated, still operates a lot of places, has operated for a long, long time, and how America used to operate. The word employee wasn't even in the dictionary until around the late 1900s. It didn't exist, right? You didn't have the idea of being an employee. And so what I saw in Nicaragua, in Granada, was the whole family could be there. The baby, if there's a baby, the baby can be like crawling around on the floor or being held by someone who's working, or the grandmother is, in the back room. So the children are back there with her. So I saw how it works when the place that people are working is the same as where their family is.
Right.
Whether that's, as I said, this was a kind of an urban area. So in this case, it was little stores, or services, but farms. And that was how in the United States, that was how most people lived until the 1860s. So that was the first thing, right? And then there was this whole movement, of course, that it was this sort of idea that it's like sort of hanging onto a shred hanging onto this shred of sort of the business of living all being in one place. Well, there has to be someone there, kind of continuing that. which of course was for good reasons, the mother. I think that there are a lot of problems with that. That wasn't the original idea, right? The original idea wasn't that there would just be one person at home all by themselves with the children. And I think that led to women feeling like, why are we like locked up here by ourselves? It's not good for their mental health, which is not good for their children. So the kind of the isolation of that wasn't good, but it was, at least young children were able to be in a kind of a stable, familiar environment for their earliest years. And now both because women are focused on their careers and because of economic reasons, there's we've left raising young children out of the picture. Like we have nothing in our society now that focused on raising young children. And so we're kind of groping around to figure out, someone has to raise these young children. And what in our society deals with children? Schools. So we'll just sort of expand that to accommodate these children that aren't being raised by anyone.
Is there a distinction between sort of these formal pre-K programs and something like daycare? Is there any evidence that one might be better than the other or anything like that?
That's kind of a false distinction, right? From the point of view of a child, all that matters is the experience they're having.
Right.
And so the idea of daycare was that it was almost, I think of it as sort of the parking garage model of child rearing, right? It's like you need a safe place to keep your car while you go to work. So you put your car in this place and it's guarded and so forth, and then you pick it up at the end of the day, right? Yeah. I think that had been our original idea for childcare. Like these babies are just sort of lying there, these young children, they're just learning to talk. They're just learning to walk. Anyone can talk to them, right? So we can just leave them there and then pick them up at the end of the day. And what developmental science tells us is that's completely wrong. This is actually the most important period of human development in the human lifespan. So, like I said, now we're saying, it is important. So we can't just have, quote, daycare, which is sort of like a parking garage. Now we have to recognize that it needs to actually be preschool. But that's not right either, because that is not the appropriate early development environment for young children. And so the question really isn't, do the people just have high school degrees and they just play with the kids, or are they learning the alphabet? It's like the question isn't the curriculum.
The question is, where are they?
The question is, where are they?
And who are they with?
Yes. And if you put yourself in the position of the child, right? If you do a search on the internet for tips for helping your child to the transition to childcare, there's just many, many articles on how to cope with the fact that your child is just completely freaking out at being left at childcare. It's like, it's very difficult. They'll adjust. So the fact that your child is like basically screaming in pain as you are leaving.
All the articles are basically, here's how you put the earplugs in.
Essentially, yeah. That's right. And the reason that children, like I said, an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old can be excited to go to school. They can be excited to see their friends, right? There's things for them to do. They have their own life, right? But that's just not that's just not true about an infant or a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. They want to stay home. And as I was saying before, there's a really big difference between a part-time program, right? So if you drop the child off and the child knows you're going to be back in 3 hours, it's not from first thing in the morning till the end of the day. And what the research has shown is that there is a real difference in the impact of that, which would make sense, right? I mean, it's if it's a few hours a day, that's just part of a child's day that they can kind of, sort of tolerate. Mm-hmm. If it's the majority of their waking hours for the majority of their early years, that's just a really radical way to be thinking about raising young children.
I get the sense that this is one of those questions where people, because of the discomfort associated with the implication, dance around all of the potential consequences without actually focusing on, what's the fundamental number at the heart of it. What's the age that you think is actually appropriate for the first time for children to be in that 9 to 5 or 9 to 4, whatever environment, completely away from the family? So we started at, 8 or no mandatory at all a century ago.
Exactly, right.
Where's that line supposed to be?
Well, I think children vary. So every parent that I've spoken to there's one, the assistant director of my organization, for example, she has 2 sons who are now in their late teens. One of them was, just such a much more resilient, much more eager to kind of go out. And the other one was a much more reserved, shy child. Mm-hmm. So there's differences between children that are enormously important that parents are very aware of. Mm-hmm. I think I taught in preschool for a number of years with 4-year-olds, and I think it's very tiring for a 4-year-old to be in a program from say 8 a.m. till 6 p.m. And if it's a really good place that a 4-year-old likes to be in, that they feel safe, it's not it's not an overwhelming number of children, which is another issue. The teachers are nice to them, which is not at all always the case. The conflicts between children are managed so that it's sort of not like a constant war, which is another issue. But if it's a good place, 4-year-olds can I think really engage. What I observed was 4-year-olds really liked it. 3-year-olds are still they're 3-year-olds, I think, that are kind of more excited, are more outgoing. But my observation, I taught sometimes in the 3-year-old classrooms, and from what I understand about early sort of trajectories of early development, a 3-year-old is still. I don't think putting 3-year-olds in large group settings for large proportions of the time makes sense. Mm-hmm. And and the thing about what's so interesting is we could also ask them. One of the things I heard was going on during COVID is people would say their children were saying, "Oh, I'm so glad I get to stay home."
Yeah.
And so I and why not? Why? Part of what I am, part of my thinking is we're not thinking about the well-being of young children. Mm-hmm. We need to be focusing on the well-being of young children. If what we know about their development from science, there's a very large body of science that tells us that what people's own instincts tell them. People don't like leaving their children at childcare. Young children, you don't hear people complaining terribly about there's not a lot of articles on how to deal with taking your child to kindergarten. Like the child is like screaming and you have to walk away, right? the child is ready to go. So I think that is, there's just the way we can think about a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, maybe a 4-year-old, just does not apply to the first 3 or 4 years of a child's life. And anyone who has children knows that it's just a vastly different developmental kind of phase.
What were some of the most egregious examples of what we did to kids in this developmental phase because of COVID?
I felt like for the youngest children who got to stay home because their parents were home, I think COVID was kind of a boon. Also for pets. Yeah. Dogs, cats, and young children were all blissfully happy during COVID. Yeah. Because that's what they want.
No one was trying to leave them at the daycare.
No one was, right. With your dog was thrilled because you were home all the time, just like the dog wants. Mm-hmm. The cats, young children. For children who were having to go, who once things were opening up, and for children who were going back to pre-K or childcare because their parents were going to work, the idea that the masks were enormously detrimental. Mm-hmm. And the way that young children learn is through interaction, through facial expressions. Mm-hmm. There were actually big advocates for that who have subsequently acknowledged that that's just developmentally very damaging for young children. Not to mention, terrifying. It's just like it's just a terrifying experience to have this thing on your face and to have it right. But a lot of young children got to stay home when otherwise they would not have. And I know people who would have been working full time who actually spent the first year or 2 years of their child's life at home with them instead of being away from them. And I think that will be something that will lay a foundation that will be valuable for the rest of that child's life. It's also interesting because there's not nearly enough survey research done on this kind of thing, but surveys have suggested that parents, there are a lot of parents who are working because they have to economically, who would much prefer to be home with their kids. And
our friend Oren Cass has done a ton of survey research on this.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, when I say there's not enough, what I mean is this is an awfully big topic for one person in the whole country to have done research on, right? So, I mean, that's the thing. It's like, this is one thing I love about Oren. It's enormously important research. I don't understand why. I'm hoping that I'll be able to work with him to do much more of it because it's just so important. Like, why would we not know these things? Why would we not know how parents feel about all this?
Well, I guess that brings up an interesting question. What are the interests at hand that are pushing for this trend to ever younger education, ever younger, full-time out of the home preschool?
Well, trend one is, as you were pointing out earlier, I mean, given the fact that we're no longer, running little stores as a family or running little farms as a family, and we're far from that, unfortunately, I think from the point of view of young children anyway, the economic pressures, the people have to work. Most of the people who are writing about this, of course, are not those people. The people who are writing about this are very, they're career-oriented people. So the take in the media has around the COVID thing, for example, was that it was, just this sort of practically a violation of human rights that you would have to stay home with your child. But that's not the way. There's a lot of people in America who don't have careers, they have jobs, right? Yeah. So their idea of utopia is not dropping their child off at 8 a.m. at a high quality free childcare center to go to their job as an assistant manager at Walmart. Yeah. Like they would much rather be home raising their own child.
But if you're a New York Times journalist.
If you're a New York Times journalist, you can't be a New York Times journalist if you are also going to be spending full time raising your own child. And that's a legitimate choice. But one thing is good for a baby and the other thing is good for a grown-up. Having a great career is great for the person who has it, but that doesn't mean that the implications for a young child are what's best for that young child. And leaving that group of people out of it, at the very least, there's a whole lot of people who would rather be raising their own children. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of heartbreaking that they aren't able to raise their own kids and their kids are not able to be at home.
What are the contours of the national legislative push underway right now? I know that greater funding for childcare has been a massive, in some cases, bipartisan push over the last few years. Tell me a little bit about what some of the specific proposals have been and what those political coalitions have looked like.
Yeah. So the other thing, actually, I want to say on the forces. So the one force is that, right? Mm-hmm. The other force is the other force is. I don't know exactly how to put this, but it's a very kind of a very individualist sort of way of thinking that, well, I guess this is what I would say. It is the case that for a long time, let's say a married couple, a man and a woman have a child. The man just goes on with his life. Right? He has a child, he gets to have a child, but he doesn't miss a step in his life. So let's just say he was working really hard. He has a career. He's something he loves doing. I'm talking about the career people now, right? Right. Mm-hmm. And so he gets to have a child and have his normal self-fulfilled life. And I think what women have felt is that's not fair, right? That why is that? You know, we have a man and a woman have a child. The man just goes on with his life. The woman's life is transformed, right? And so I am very sympathetic to that. The response has been, well, we need to set things up so that the woman has the exact same experience as the man, which is you have a child and you kind of don't miss a beat, which is very true. I know many guys who that's what happened. They were they took a week off and then they're right back and, they're just going right. They didn't miss a beat. And so the idea is that women should be able to do that too, right? You have a baby, but that doesn't transform anything. You just continue right along as you were. And I have no problem with women doing that. The problem is we've just left children out of the equation.
Right.
Now there's no one to be raising the children. So I think that those two, I was thinking about your last question. Those two forces together, right? The economics of people having to work in this one group, and then this kind of wave, this sort of ideology or expectation on this other side of total equality between a man and a woman has led to just leaving children out of the equation. And what I have noticed is that I've known a number of young couples in Washington, D.C. that were two, sort of power couples where the guy was the one who stayed home with a baby for a couple of years. I don't think that when we're talking about someone staying home with a child, that that necessarily means that we're trying to put women, behind white picket fences barefoot. I don't think that's what it means anymore. And a lot of younger guys are perfectly happy or want to play that role. So in terms of the legislation, the focus of the legislation is the response to these two trends, which is we have left raising children out of our social equation here because we have this group that has to work. And then, of course, there's the third gigantic group that's a problem for children, which is there's only one parent. So you basically have this one group in which all parents have to work, however many there are. And then this other group, which is kind of built a culture of where women are as focused on their careers as men, and which is fine. But the children are left out, and so now we need to invent this whole giant system to raise them, and that is that's to me, that's sort of dystopian. We're not going to be able to. We're not going to be able to bring children up to have it to be healthy, happy people without devoting the time and the attention and the love that they need to develop well. And right now, our society has not prioritized that.
How does that interact with another theme that people in our circles have talked about, which is the unusual, at least historically speaking, the unusual singular vessel for all our hopes and dreams that we've turned children into. So the over investment, usually because people are having much fewer children than they would have historically, and turning children into this like Veblen good that is potentially way over invested in terms of and creates a barrier to entry, at least culturally, and then downstream financially for people to have kids at all.
I haven't actually thought about that. It's such a paradox, right? It's like this. It's like this. That's just a paradox, because on the one end, we're kind of systematically refusing to build in investing in young children what they need, which is time and attention. That's what young children need: time and attention of their family, of their parents. And that's inconvenient, but it is human nature. It's beyond human nature. It's, all mammals, most species, that's how you develop, right? So you're right. But then on the other end of it, so we're trying to systematically depriving young children of that, which is what they need more than that's essential, kind of an essential foundation. But then on the other end, there's this immense amount of attention. But is it time and attention, or is it money? I mean, you know what I mean? Like our
right. And so if you have to pay for tons of daycare, then it becomes a money investment, and the education costs seem to be the primary thing people talk about. Oh, putting the kid through college. Oh, putting the childcare and everything.
Yes.
I mean, a crib, blankets, and clothes don't cost that much in the grand scheme of things.
No, they don't. And I think, but in terms of the later, the sort of this as you were saying, over investment in this or massive investment in children. I haven't thought about this, but it seems like I'm wondering if that actually ends up being you're paying for lessons, and you're paying for camps, and you're paying for these kinds of things. But I'm wondering if it's. I'm thinking maybe that all that kind of famous, you're paying for very good colleges. But you're not putting your own time into it. You're paying money.
Right.
It's very expensive. But you actually carving out a piece of yourself, your time, your attention, your love. I'm thinking that's maybe not been increasing drastically. Yeah, that is not necessary. I don't think that's been decreasing at the rate that the spending on children is increasing.
As a related phenomenon, you had mentioned earlier how it is an affirmative good for children to be in an environment where there is a diversity of ages present. The historical way that was done was they had siblings that were of different ages than them. It seems to me that that in this moment of time we find ourselves in, the public policy debate could easily go your way on the question of, okay, we should put a pause on the idea of ever earlier schooling, and kids should be home with their parents. What seems, I think, a greater lift is the idea people should be having much more kids, and there's so many cultural barriers against that, and potentially financial ones as well. What are the affirmative benefits that you've seen to living in an environment with at least 2, but 3, 4, 5 children in a home, as opposed to just 1?
Well, I think part of the issue is it doesn't have to necessarily be in the home. So one of the things I saw in Nicaragua was there would be, extended families that lived, within a block or 2 of each other. So there's cousins, right? So you didn't necessarily have 6 children in one household in Granada, but there would be a group, a network, like a group of, 6 or 8 kids who were cousins and, sometimes neighbors, but a lot of times cousins and siblings. And they're also, there's not the helicoptering and I don't know, liability thing that we have here. And so children would be out playing on the street, and you would see like little 6-year-old kids lugging a baby along with them. And you've just never seen such a happy baby. Now, sometimes do they get dropped? I think they probably sometimes get dropped. There are plenty of people who would say that's not a risk worth taking. I think that it is. I think the cost benefit analysis for the baby is this was a very good thing for babies. Yeah. And just the kind of, children in Nicaragua, it's just, you see their faces are different. They smile differently. It's just absolutely striking. The kind of joy once you get older, once maybe starting at around age 12, you'd be better off in the United States. Prior to that, I think a child is better off barring abject poverty, where you have inadequate nutrition. But if just being poor, you don't have shoes, but you have a joyful life. There was a kind of a joy there that children had that I don't see here. Yeah. But in any case, so I think having 6 kids all in one house can be great, but that can also be, I don't think that's necessarily that's a complicated enterprise to manage, right? Without other people around, without grandparents. Sure. But if children are able to, if children are playing, even just having 1 sibling or 2 siblings, having children around in your neighborhood, or being part of a community where children are with each other. For young children, this really struck me when I was in the airport. So we don't see kids outside much anymore, right? You don't just see kids running around playing. When I grew up, actually, we just went outside and played. And with all kinds of kids, which I think was much better for kids. I don't know how kids live without doing that now. But anyway, but parents are so guarded of their children. In airports, you can actually see children sort of like interacting in the wild, because it's all carpeted. There's a lot of big spaces. Parents are kind of exhausted, right? Yeah. And so in early childhood, the sort of one of the key phrases is high quality adult-child interactions. So the way you measure, one of the ways you measure the quality of an environment is and this is not necessarily a bad thing, but there are sort of techniques for literally counting the number of, quote, high quality adult-child interactions. Which do happen, and if they're not happening at all, that's a bad thing. Yeah. Anyway, but that's sort of considered to be the gold standard, right? Yeah. So I would be in these airports watching, and I'm seeing like these young children. You'll see 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds. They are not seeking high quality adult-child interactions. They are running after the bigger kids. Yeah. After their older sibling, right? Yeah. Or whoever else they're traveling with, or just kids they meet in the airport. Yeah. But they are not seeking out, a 2-year-old does not seek out other 2-year-olds. A 2-year-old does not seek out a high quality adult child interaction.
Yeah. A
2-year-old seeks out a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old.
Right.
And and that's something you just don't see anymore. And that anyone who has multiple children will also tell you that those relationships are hugely important in both directions. But younger siblings learn an enormous amount from their older sibling. We've always developed that way.
And older siblings learn responsibility.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
That makes the potential of having and rearing children seem much less alien.
That is absolutely true. Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And I actually hadn't even thought about that, but you're right. So in the streets of Granada, little kids are all playing, they're in mixed age groups and there's babies around and they're, or just, toddlers, and they're taking care of them. So that's just, that's you could be 4 and you'll be taking care of a young child, and that's not considered unusual, and you're not considered incapable of doing it either.
Yeah. If you think about it, there is a plurality of Americans that live in something like this, where, they're born, maybe there is a sibling born very close in age to them, so they don't have any core memories of them being an infant. They go into the public school system where they're exclusively around people their own age all the way until 12th grade. Chances are their parents are friends with people to a similar age to them, therefore they never see the infants there. I mean, people might be adults before they ever spend
That's a really good point.
any serious time around a child, which is partially why it becomes such a high barrier to entry. People think like, this is an alien. I've never seen, what do you do with it? Like they don't,
that is a really good
experience.
point. No, I hadn't thought about that, but I think you're absolutely correct. Yeah. And of course, for, that idea is just absurd in a lot of societies. Like in Granada, I mean, the idea that a child would grow up without having had any exposure to an infant is just, that they take care of the infants. Yeah. And in our society as well. So when I was growing up, I started babysitting when I was 10. I was left alone at age 10. I was a very responsible 10-year-old.
Yeah, that might be one of the few vectors left where people do it. And now New York wants to require a bachelor's degree to babysit.
Well, it's not even that. It's like, no one leaves a baby with a 10-year-old now.
Yeah.
No one leaves a baby. You yourself won't. And I understand that. I mean, if you have a baby one day, it's unlikely because our thinking has just changed about children. We see children as so much less capable than we used to. I started my own little summer camp preschool program, which I ran with a friend when I was 11. And it was in Seattle, Washington. It was mostly 3-year-olds, a couple 2-year-olds, and these mothers just dropped their children off with an 11-year-old. And I had a group of them for like a few hours, a couple of times a week.
You get arrested for that.
I would be literally, they would be arrested. They would be arrested, literally. I don't think people I think people are hesitant these days even to hire, say, a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old to babysit. Yeah. So that's your point. It's a very good point that where would young people be exposed to taking care of babies? You're right. There's it's very interesting.
One of the things that has been the most disturbing trend in American life is that if you go to a typical elementary school today, you see a lot of obese children. You see there's clearly a crisis of public health happening across American society when it comes to just the health of people. What are its antecedents, its roots in the age range that you tend to focus on? What are the ways that American life is fundamentally unhealthy for very young children today?
It's certainly the case that obesity rates among very young children have just skyrocketed. I think this also points back to what I mentioned earlier, that we are neglecting the healthcare system in thinking about early childhood policy. I mean, this is that is universal childcare is not going to address this obesity question. I don't know what's causing it. I mean, there's the obvious, which is that in general, people are eating very high calorie, non-nutritious food. People aren't getting exercise. Young children are getting a lot less exercise because they're not allowed to run around outside like they used to. I also wonder. I also wonder to what extent the way that family lives are structured is often very stressful for everyone in the family. So if you are trying to raise children and you're working one job or two jobs, there's those kinds of factors. People are very stressed. So if you are stressed and your child is stressed, one way to distract your child or get your child to calm down is to give them something, give them candy, right? Give them something to eat.
Or an iPad.
Well, an iPad, which is a whole other issue, right? Exactly. Again, it's like filling a nurture gap. So if we think of nurture as basically time and attention, loving time and attention, we have a kind of a deadly nurture gap going on. And one thing that could be helping to fill that is food. It's very difficult to resist, if your kid is throwing a fit and wants your attention and you're just too stressed and exhausted and you just can't deal with it, to just give them something, to give them ice cream or give them chips or give them whatever it is. I don't know how much that is. I do not know to what extent. There's lack of exercise. There's a generally poor diet across the board. And then there is, to what extent is food being used to fill this nurture gap. But parents care a lot about their children, and I think we're not doing enough to give them the information they need about what they need to do, and pediatricians are, I think, really the kind of a crucial leverage point for that. But the long-term effects of this phenomenon for health costs in this country are just enormous. I mean, this is going to be causing enormous health problems down the road for decades.
What are the big legislative proposals that are on offer here in DC right now on the themes that we've been discussing in this podcast? Are there any that you think are potentially good? I assume most of them are quite bad along these lines because there's been a big push towards earlier and earlier childcare systems. What does the landscape look like right now?
Well, as you said, the major push is for, quote, public education starting at birth and federally funded public education starting at birth. So with the K-12 system, the federal government pays about 10% of it. The 90% is paid by state and local. The sort of the policy idea in the early childhood space is that the public early childhood education system would be funded by the federal government. So that was a cornerstone of Build Back Better, and that idea is not going away. I guess the other big question on the table has to do with the child tax credit, and I think, first of all, I'm very much more enthusiastic about federal spending that's targeted to lower income working people. One of the problems that I've had with a bunch of these proposals is they include people who are making who are quite affluent, who of course would rather have more money, but don't need it. And I don't know enough about how people have used the child tax credit to really have a sense of what I think of it. So there was a famous study so there's a lot of focus on child poverty, and obviously being the problem with child poverty for young children is not the poverty per se, but primarily the problem is the stress on the parents, and especially maternal stress is a very detrimental impact on early childhood development, starting prenatal. So it is detrimental to young children's development if they're living in a household with adults who are very stressed about being in poverty. I have not seen data on what people do with extra money that they get. So if it's something that's reducing the stress, that's going to help children. If it's something that's not reducing their stress, that's not going to help children. And in terms of people, one thing people can the child tax credit has, quote, reduced child poverty, but I just don't know enough about what's actually happening to have a sense of how much is that helping kids. I mean, basically it costs X. And is it helping children? If it costs, is it helping children 1/10 of the amount that it's costing, or are we getting enough bang for our buck, or would that money be better spent on something else? I don't know the answer to that. It does seem that people with young children having more money is overall a good thing. There's complicated issues, obviously, with people. I wrote a policy proposal with a colleague at AEI, Matt Weidinger, showing how the child tax credit could be used. People could be showing we proposed an idea for allowing people to take an advance on the child tax credit to turn it into really meaningful, like, amounts of money in the first 1 or 2 or 3 years of a child's life. So instead of sort of dribbling it out, back then when we wrote this, it was, what was it, $3,000 a year or $2,000? I forget what it was, smaller, right? But that amount dribbled, even $3,000 dribbled over years is it is of some use. But if you allowed people to take an advance on that money, so they were able to actually use it to stay home themselves for a year or two, reduce their work schedule from full-time to part-time, or if they're poor, to actually pay for much higher quality childcare. Wealthy people I've never seen, all the wealthy people I know put their children have nannies, which is 1-to-1 or 1-to-2, or put the maximum ratio, the maximum number of children with babies that I've seen wealthy people choose is 3 babies to 1 person. So if you're allowing lower income people to take an advance on their child tax credit, they will have access to the kind of higher quality care that wealthier people already use. But in terms of how, is it a game changer for children if parents are getting $3,000 or $4,000 a year? I realize this is not a good answer to your question, but I just don't know how to think about that.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Katharine, what's your new think tank going to be primarily focused on? What can people go to the website to learn more about in these early days? You just launched a few days ago, so obviously
yes,
there's plenty more to come. But what can people expect and really learn to lean on you guys for?
Well, I founded CCFP.
Center for Child and Family Policy.
Thank you. I founded Center for Child and Family Policy to fill what I've seen as a gap in the early childhood field, which is there's almost no research and policy work being done in early childhood. Most of the major early childhood organizations are focused on advocacy. Mm-hmm. They tend to be left leaning. There are no major, very few left-leaning think tanks do work in early childhood, and no right-leaning think tanks now do. Mm-hmm. And so that's a gap. The way that the field has kind of developed, it's been very the policy debate has been very one-sided. Mm-hmm. It's been dominated by left-leaning advocates, academics, funders, and the right has really been relatively unengaged in this topic. Mm-hmm. So there's been kind of a vacuum. That's narrowed the policy debate. So to, as we've been talking about, this very sort of small slice of what we should be talking about, early education, leaving out early health, leaving out families, the role of families. And there's a lack of debate in the field. So meaningful debate cannot take place with only one side talking. Mm-hmm. So what I'm aiming to do is to create a platform that will highlight these ideas that have been left out of the debate, elevate questions that have not been asked, create new space for more robust debate. And also create a platform for there are great people scattered around who are in the field of early childhood and family and early childhood and child and family policy, but they're disparate. There's no place for them to come together, and so I'm hoping that we'll be able to kind of bring some of those people together. Just to expand the scope of what we're thinking and talking about. And first and more than anything, I'm hoping to just focus the conversation on the well-being of young children in our society. What growing up, being born into and growing up in our society means for a young child. That needs to be the center of our thinking in this policy area. And I'm hoping to help underscore that.
What's the link to the website and how can people find you on social media?
The link to the website, it's www.ccfp.org. And I am on Twitter at KB Stevens.
Wonderful. Well, congratulations on launching the new organization. Much needed. And excited to pour over everything that you guys put out over the next few years. Thank you for coming on the podcast, Katharine.
Thanks so much.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. We certainly enjoyed taping it. As always, be sure to subscribe to this episode and rate it 5 stars. We always do appreciate that. If you write something interesting in your review, we'll be sure to show it on the show. We're getting very close to the end of season 2 here, so start sending in ideas for season 3 guests. We would really appreciate that. Any ways you think we should change the program, if you think I should be kicked off the show, that'd be eminently reasonable. We're really grateful that you guys have listened to us all this year and look forward to seeing you next week.
Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to AmericanMoment.org to learn more.